emotional regulation.
I really loved all the suggestions. They were really fantastic. So thanks, guys. So I'm going to just talk about emotional regulation. I'm going to use the words emotional regulation and self-regulation kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation. So just wanted to put that out there. Next slide, please. This is just a little overview of what we'll be kind of discussing today. Next slide. So really, emotional regulation refers to a child's ability to identify and manage their feelings, and then therefore the actions related to their feelings. Self-regulation really is not innate. I think we all think that it's something we're kind of born with. It's really a skill that needs to be taught. And children really look to their caregivers, adults, and then people around them that love them to help learn self-regulation skills. Teaching these skills can really be difficult and uncomfortable. We don't want to put ourselves in an uncomfortable situation. We definitely don't want our children or those we love to be in an uncomfortable situation. But I always say, don't shy away from it. It's a really great teaching moment, even if at that moment it seems really overwhelming and difficult to regulate in that moment. It's really important. It's really also important that we learn about our own self-regulation needs and that we honor our own self-care needs. That's the best way we're going to be able to provide the support for the children that we love. And also, just one other thing to think about is that the way that we self-regulate or the things that we need might not be in line with our child's needs or the way that they have to process things. So it's really important to find ways to complement your style and your child's style. Next slide, please. Okay. So one thing that I always like to think about is that any behavior, so anything that a child does is really a way of communicating. They're trying to, so our job is like, what is that child trying to tell us? Why is that behavior occurring? That's very, very important. Some important information to think about when you see any kind of a behavior. And by a behavior, I don't mean it needs to be something that's negative or that we don't want to see. It can be something that we really like, but we want to think about the intensity of the behavior, the frequency, how often is it happening? Where does it occur? Where doesn't it occur? We want to think about any kind of medical factors that could be impacting the child. We want to make sure that that child feels okay. And then we need to think really strongly about what skills does the child have or what skills does the child need to have to replace any kind of negative behaviors. So that could include communication, their ability, their play skills, self-regulation. I think I always want to say that it's really important to rule out any kind of medical issues. So definitely bring up any concerns with your doctor, your primary care doctor, developmental pediatrician, another trusted medical professional, could be a therapist, just to kind of come up to see if there's things like GI issues, maybe migraines, maybe there is some anxiety or some ADHD, something else that could be impacting the behaviors that you're seeing. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of like common triggers of some behaviors that you might see. So one could be escape, like a demand is placed, the child doesn't want to do something, they want to get away from that demand, they want to get out of a certain place, it doesn't meet their sensory needs. It could be something tangible, they, want something and then they're told no, or they're being asked to wait, and the kid really wants access to that thing or that activity right now. Could just be attention. There's a lot of downtime. They're bored. Maybe their parent is talking to another child. They're looking for that interaction or attention. Or it could be something more automatic. So that's can be that, a child doesn't have the ability to independently come up with play activities or have, things that they like to do. They need a high level of sensory stimuli and that the environment is like has a really low sensory stimuli. Automatic kind of triggers of behaviors are often sensory in nature. That might be when you see some kind of what you might call like a self-stimming behavior or more of like a repetitive play. Next slide, please. And then some things that might reinforce this behavior, so then that might cause it to continue. So that's just something to think about, something that you can try out. If you see one of these behaviors happening, you come up with an idea of like, maybe this is why it's happening. So if a child wants to escape a demand and you stop that demand, then that can cause that if they were screaming to get out of that demand and you stop it, that might cause the behavior to increase. So the screaming might continue to increase every time you give the child a demand because it worked. If you give them something that they want or give them more time with the item, that could cause that behavior to continue. If a child is seeking your attention, and even if you're kind of reprimanding them or scolding them, they're getting the attention, that could cause that behavior to continue. Automatic, kind of those like innate intrinsic sensory needs, that's a little bit harder to reinforce externally. It's often like an internal motivation. So really what you want to do is in general, just make sure that the child has access to the sensory stimuli that they need in more of a functional way. Next slide, please. And then the emotional responses that you might see a child have in response to any kind of situation. It could be too big, it could be too small, it could be completely non-congruent, or it could just be right. So the example will be like a sibling takes a favorite toy from the child. A too big reaction would be the child screaming, they start throwing items, they throw a tantrum for 30 minutes. A too small kind of reaction we would expect is just like really not caring that the child took his favorite toy and just ignore the whole situation. Non-congruent might be that the child starts laughing or giggling. And really, when we think about what the just right or what the emotional response, if we feel like someone has good self-regulation, would be, yes, you're going to become a little angry, you're going to become irritated. You might try to hit, you might try to call a parent to come over and help. You might scream, but then you'll be able to calm yourself down when you have support from that trusted adult. Next slide, please. I'm just going to do a little review on sensory systems because having a well-organized sensory system will really help with your self-regulation. We're all probably really familiar with touch, sound, smell, taste, and vision. Proprioception is really like where your body is in space, where the parts of your body is in relation to each other. You need that for good motor awareness. You might see difficulties with proprioception in a child that is like bumping into the walls when they're trying to walk around the room, maybe walking on their tiptoes. Vestibular is really their sense of movement. So you might see a child that has an underreactive vestibular system. They're constantly moving and running and spinning. They need more vestibular input. Or you might see a child that has like a hypersensitive vestibular system. They might not like when they're turned upside down or they have to have their head tilted back to have their hair washed. And then one other system that's really closely linked to emotional regulation is interoception. It provides insight on like how our internal organs are feeling. It allows us to, see if we have a stomach ache, if we're hungry, if we're tired, if we have pain somewhere in our body. Research has really shown that our ability to read our own physical signals directly relate to how well we can identify and regulate our own emotional states. So that's for us as adults. It impacts children, especially children with autism. And then if we can't kind of identify our own emotional states, then it makes it really hard to identify them in others, and that can be kind of just like a basic trait of autism as well. Next slide, please. And then just remember, sensory processing is kind of like a computer. So, on the keyboard, we have things coming in from our environment, lots of different stimuli, and then we have our hard drive. And, that's where our processing happens. If we think about that's our brain, we're going to try to come up with a response, a reaction to that sensory input that comes in. And then what we see on the screen is kind of the behavior that we see, or maybe a motor response. The most important thing to think about with sensory processing is there could be a breakdown in any of those systems or all of those systems. So it's really hard to kind of go through life having a really well-run computer. So when you are kind of like identifying different behaviors, you have to see like where in the system that might be having a breakdown. Next slide, please. These are kind of ways that I like to think about kids that have particular sensory needs. I will say that your sensory needs, your child's sensory needs can change from hour to hour, day to day, but you know, you have kids that need more sensory input. They need more of that for an optimal state of arousal. So those would be kids that are like sensory seeking. They are actively seeking out a lot of sensory input. They might be running around and wanting to touch everything. And so the goal is really to give them that input they need, but more in a structured way to prevent too much. Lots of times when kids seek sensory information, they seek it too much and then they become overstimulated, which then can cause a breakdown in their regulation. Other kids that need more sensory input are kind of what we call low registers. So they don't feel, for lack of a better word, like feel sensory input as much as maybe you or I would, or as much as we would expect. And they might not actively seek that additional sensory input because they're not really sure that they need it. So those might be kids that seem just pretty passive. They might just not initiate play. They might be kind of content with just like sitting on the floor and looking out the window. So our goal is to give them some sensory input to observe some sort of active response. And then you have kids that really are a little hypersensitive to the world and they need less sensory input to be in a good optimal state of arousal. So those are kids that sensory input comes in, it's like it's really overwhelming, and they might not necessarily remove themselves from the situation. So they could be somewhere where it's really, really loud and that's really overwhelming. And instead of covering their ears or asking to leave, they just become overstimulated and might start screaming. So our job is really to give them just a little bit of the sensory input to prevent that overstimulation and that shutdown. And then you have those kids that I'm sure you've seen that are just they register that sensory input so intensely and they'll actively avoid it. So they might also seem like they seem very anxious, like they don't want to try new things because they're just unsure of what the sensory situation might be like. So then our job is to be providing small amounts of sensory input in a safe way, very gradual and structured, so kids know what to expect to kind of help them be able to process that. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of review of what we just kind of talked about. A big thing that I will always say is the strategy that works well one day might not work well the next day because the child's sensory system in relation to their self-regulation can change from hour to hour. So it's really important to kind of come up with your own, like, box of strategies, like your toolbox of things that you can try if one thing doesn't work. And I always like to say you really want to incorporate any kind of sensory-based activities like throughout a child's day to help them keep that regulated state to optimize learning. Kind of don't use a sensory activity or a sensory response when things kind of get to be too much. When a child is becoming dysregulated, you really want to use it to kind of help mitigate the dysregulation. Next slide. Okay. Just to talk a little bit about behaviors that you may see, the same behavior that, so I'm going to use the example of throwing a toy car. It could be a way to communicate various feelings. So then the way that you're going to respond to that and the way you're going to address it will be different. So it could mean I'm hungry. That's an internal or an interoceptive need. It could mean I'm overstimulated. My body and brain can't filter out all the stuff that's going on around me. It could be I'm upset that you turned off my iPad. It might be that the child's rigid or is a little inflexible. I want it what I want when I want it. It could be that I can't get the card to roll across the floor. It might be then it's a skill deficit. They're not able to manipulate an item. Or it might just be frustration that you didn't understand that I didn't want the green car. I wanted the red car, but I couldn't communicate that effectively. And that's why I threw the car. Next slide. So we think about maybe a child that's hungry, so if a child with autism doesn't know that they're hungry, if they have a lack of their interoception, they might not actively seek out or ask for food or drink. So something that you could try would be to keep your child on a schedule as much as possible for food and drink to help alleviate dysregulation due to hunger or thirst. Next slide. If a child is overstimulated, that they can't fill, you want to remove extraneous stimuli that might be too much for a child. You want to offer some sensory strategies that might help calm his or her body and support attention. Have your basket of tricks, different options that might be helpful, providing support to help your child calm. And then always remember that we talked about earlier. What's calming for you might not be calming for your child. So don't automatically assume like, oh, I really like to put a blanket over my head and that makes me feel better. That might not just work for your kid. So working with, you know, therapist or just kind of like spending time, seeing what your child gravitates towards can help you kind of determine what might be calming for them. Next slide. I'm upset that you turned off my iPad. So, you know, provide continued warning, countdowns, timers. Don't go right into, if you take away that iPad, don't go right into a challenging or non-preferred activity. Offer another item or activity that they like, or maybe something that's new and exciting to them. Have the child involved in that choice. Be firm and consistent with your expectation. Expect that there's going to be some negative behaviors that occur. I know you guys talk so much about that in the case study. And build in a time throughout the day where maybe the child can have the iPad and really honor that schedule. So even if it's not, a great time for you, if you said from 1:30 to 2 that that's their iPad time, honor that to build that trust and in your child that they're going to be able to have the time with that iPad. Next slide. If it's something like a skill deficit that they can't get the car to roll across the floor, work with OT or physical therapy to help identify and work on skills like imitation, fine motor, coordination, and strength. You might need a little hand over hand help. You might need to help a child like accept any kind of touch. Maybe they don't want to touch the item. So maybe there is a sensory component that they're a little tactile defensive. So you might need to even take some steps back and work on that first. Sometimes children work really best. They learn how to manipulate an item by watching it on a video or watching somebody else do it. So those are some options. Books are always great as well. Next slide, please. If it's the frustration about that you don't understand what it is that they want, work with your therapist, especially your speech language pathologist, on expanding expressive languages. Offer choices, maybe two actual choices or pictures of the item so that the child can pick what they would like. Keep items in sight, but kind of out of reach so that they can work on pointing or requesting. So not the child can't necessarily get it independently, but can see it and kind of help to let you know what it is that they want. And make sure that if you are using pictures, that you have the items available. Only offer choices to a child if you're willing to honor the choices. So I always say, if you're going to give the child the ability to say no, then you have to honor that no. So if it's like, do you want to get dressed? And the child says no, then okay, I have to honor that. I gave you the choice. If I want to say, instead, I'm going to say, okay, we're going to get dressed. You can pick shorts or pants. Then the child gets to pick a choice, and I can honor that a lot easier than the no, I don't want to get dressed. Next slide. So teaching foundational skills for self-regulation really kind of start to be laid down between the ages of 1 and 5 years of age. Moments of dysregulation, including yourself, can be really good teaching moments. Demonstrate more appropriate behaviors. So that's why it's really extremely important that you address your own self-care needs. Take care of you. Play games that require stop and start skills like red light, green light, freeze tag, Simon Says. Turn-taking games can be really good at self-regulating. Rhythmic and repetitive activities, singing songs like Ants Go Marching, dancing, banging on a drum, marching like a soldier, listening to like spa music, light projectors, anything that's kind of rhythmic and repetitive can kind of help with some of that emotional regulation. Next slide. Routines are incredibly important. You want to communicate routines with written or visual or verbal if a child understands that. When a routine becomes a ritual, though, I always want to say this, it's no longer functional because things happen in life. It's really important to teach your child that unexpected things will happen. So as a child starts to learn a routine and become comfortable with that, build in small changes to help with generalization and flexibility. And that's extremely important with individuals with autism. Schedule only a couple activities at a time to allow for some flexibility. And even within maybe a morning routine, you could do, we're going to brush teeth, get dressed, and eat breakfast. And maybe the child can pick the order of those three activities. And then always follow something hard with something easier or more preferred. Next slide. Um, as we all know, changes can be extremely stressful for children with autism, especially if it's unexpected or a child is unprepared. So again, some of those warnings, countdowns, timers, schedules, social stories, um, kind of anything to let a child know when something's going to start and when something's going to end can really help. Next slide, please. Visual supports. So visual schedules, they can help with like using communication. You can use them for coping skills, or social skills. So if a child has trouble maybe understanding verbal language or needs some help of like coming up, like you give them some strategies that can help them calm down, but they can't kind of generate those ideas on their own. I often what I call them coping cards, and I'll draw little pictures or write words of kind of choices that kids can make. As I can say, you seem to be getting a little overwhelmed right now. Let's look at your coping cards. Here's 5 different cards. Which one do you want to do today to help your body calm down? So that's something else that like visual supports can be helpful. Next slide, please. Some pictures of those. There's some choice boards. Next slide. Some social stories to kind of let kids know what's going to happen or what to expect or what might happen. Next slide. So these are some different, like the cognitive picture rehearsal. So some ideas of things that kids can choose if they're feeling a little overstimulated or overwhelmed, dysregulated. Next slide. Some sensory strategies you can, really work with your OT. So I wrote down some alerting input. So things like movement, spinning, swinging, light touch is very alerting, bright lights, loud music, rocking quickly, erratic movements, bright colors, visually complex, or shiny items, chewing crunchy foods, strong and sour flavors. Calming input might be swinging in one direction, using really firm touch, massage, dim lights, soft rhythmic music, heavy work activity, gentle bouncing, pushing heavy objects, sucking from a straw. So there are different sensory-based activities that can also help kind of increase your arousal or decrease your arousal if you're feeling a little overstimulated or dysregulated. Next slide. And then just like organize areas in the home to create designated spaces for things, keep spaces tidy. That will help prevent overstimulation. It can assist, you can help, a child learn a skill like cleaning up. And then just ensure your child's physical safety and their sensory safety. So secure dangerous items, safety locks on things, use sound deafening headphones if you need to. I always like to create a quiet area that's kind of safe if a child's having a hard time. It's like you can go to your safe space and take a break. It's kind of like a safer place for them to tantrum. Next slide. Support bags for the community. The different things might be visual supports like timers, sensory toys, preferred snacks or toys. Reduce sensory or items that trigger that might become too overstimulating or obsessive. So like video games, iPad access, or certain snacks. And set boundaries around your child's highly preferred toys or items. You might want to interrupt that intermittently or save when you really need to get things done. So if you need a child to be quiet because you have a meeting, on Zoom for work, you might want to save the iPad time for those particular moments. Next slide. And these are just some things to remember. So if you see something that is challenging, you have to replace it with something that's positive, that meets the child's same needs. So, for example, you want to teach a child to use a picture board to make a request to replace the behavior of hitting. You want to acknowledge your child's feelings. You want to let them know that you can offer support to them, but you want to encourage them to be active in managing their regulation to the best of their ability, and that will change as a child changes in ages and developmental levels. And then you're going to want to work with your providers to help identify strategies that help with regulation for you and for your child too. Consistency is really necessary, and that's really going to help provide a safe space for your for your child to practice self-regulation. And I always find it's really important to set up the environment to support a child's sensory needs, which can also support self-regulation, an optimal state of learning and prevent negative behaviors. I think that's it. Next slide. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. So we do have time for questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to type them into the chat. Feel free to raise your hand and unmute. We're happy to answer, discuss as a group. It's so much good information. I think everybody is just like taking notes and processing. So, but we do have a few minutes. So someone put comments in about potentially like working with a mental health counselor.
Yes, I think that's really important because I think autistic individuals can have a lot of like comorbidities. So often see anxiety or other mental health concerns that might be best I don't know what the word I want to use. Dr. Bennett, help me out here. Reinforced by with like a mental health professionals.
Yeah, addressed. Yeah.
Yes.
and there's comments about like for the caregivers to breathe and remain calm
Yes.
through these more challenging situations. Somebody asked about play therapy. And if anyone has comments about play therapy, I think play therapy can be tricky. I'll go first, but I'd love to hear the team because it can be lots of different things, right? Play therapy could be driven by like a curriculum that's got some research and evidence behind it, in which case it could be great for helping kids with emotional regulation. But or if the person that is conducting the play therapy has training in some of these strategies that we've talked about, that could be really effective. But then if it's just someone with toys that doesn't have a curriculum, that can be a different story sometimes.
And I feel like the curriculum, again, it works for certain kids, not for all. So it really can't be, it really needs to be individualized. And so something that might work for your friend's child might not work for your child. I think that's always really important to remember.
There's a couple of comments here. First of all, I love it because like it's already like people helping other people right there in the chat. Somebody asked for resources for visual schedules and someone popped in Do to Learn, which is a great website that I give to families. So there's others. We'll have a collection of things that we'll share out with everyone. And somebody brought up the social story or the social skill of when you winning a game versus losing a game, and how to kind of learn and teach that skill, which I also think is great.